What if Russia and Ukraine declared a ceasefire? The global consequences. Imagine waking up to a headline that no one expected. Russia and Ukraine agree to an immediate ceasefire. No more missile sirens. No more artillery strikes. No more bloody front lines stretching across Europe's largest land war since 1945. What would this mean? For Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe, for the world. Stay with us as we explore the political, economic, and military aftershocks of such a deal. Because this ceasefire, if it were ever to happen, would reshape the 21st century. And before we dive deep, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more analysis on world events that matter. The immediate shockwave. A ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine would send shockwaves across the globe. For Ukraine, it would mean a pause, a chance to rebuild shattered cities like Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Kharkiv. It would give millions of displaced Ukrainians abroad the hope of returning home. For Russia, it would mean an escape from the constant drain of war. Billions of dollars in military spending, heavy casualties, and crippling Western sanctions. And for Europe, relief. Energy prices that soared during the war could finally stabilize. Fears of escalation into NATO territory would ease. But behind that relief lies a much deeper question. What comes after the guns fall silent? The political landscape. A ceasefire would dramatically change the political dynamics. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who vowed never to surrender territory, would face a difficult choice. Accepting a ceasefire might freeze Russian control over occupied regions. But rejecting one would prolong the bloodshed. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin would claim victory. He could argue that Russia has secured its interests in Ukraine, even if the war ended inconclusively. Domestically, this would allow him to tighten his grip on power, saying Russia stood up to the West and survived. In Washington, Brussels, and London, leaders would breathe easier, but also worry. A frozen war could mean instability for decades, just like the Korean Peninsula. Would the world witness another divided Europe, locked in a fragile truce? The global economy. Perhaps the greatest impact would be economic. Since the invasion, global markets have been shaken by energy shortages, food insecurity, and disrupted trade routes. Ukraine's wheat exports, once feeding much of Africa and the Middle East, were choked by blockades. Russian oil and gas became political weapons, driving prices sky high. With a ceasefire, trade routes could reopen. Ukrainian grain could again flow through the Black Sea. Oil markets would stabilize as sanctions debates calm down. Energy bills in Europe might finally fall, easing the cost of living crisis. But, and this is crucial, would sanctions on Russia be lifted? The West would hesitate. Many leaders would argue, if we lift sanctions too quickly, Putin will rearm and strike again. Others, however, would push for normalization to avoid another global recession. This tug of war would shape the new world economy. By the way, if you're finding this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss our deep dives into global events. NATO and the security question. A ceasefire would leave NATO facing an existential question. For years, NATO's unity was strengthened by Russia's aggression. But with guns silent, would that unity weaken? Eastern European states like Poland and the Baltic nations would still warn, Russia is not finished. They would demand permanent U.S. troops on their soil. Meanwhile, countries like Germany and France might argue, let's lower tensions, let's talk peace. This split could reshape NATO itself. Would it remain a war-ready alliance? Or would it slide back into political debate and division? China's watchful eyes. Far away in Beijing, China would be watching carefully. For Xi Jinping, the war was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it distracted the West and deepened Russia's dependence on China. On the other, it destabilized global trade, hurting China's economy. A ceasefire could benefit Beijing. China could step in as a peace broker, presenting itself as a responsible global power. It could also expand trade with both Russia and Ukraine, strengthening its Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, China would ask, if Russia failed to crush Ukraine, what does that mean for us in Taiwan? A ceasefire might serve as a warning. that wars of conquest in the modern age are costly, unpredictable, and dangerous. The human impact, beyond politics and economics, lies the most important question: the people. For Ukrainians, a ceasefire would mean breathing without fear. Children could return to schools instead of bunkers. Farmers could plant crops without worrying about landmines. Refugees could come home. For Russians, it would mean the return of soldiers, the end of mobilization, and perhaps even a softening of censorship at home. But both societies would carry scars. The trauma of war, the distrust, the hatred, these do not end with a ceasefire. They last generations. A fragile peace. And let's be clear, a ceasefire is not peace. History shows us that frozen conflicts, in Korea, in Cyprus, in Georgia, often remain dangerous. If Russia and Ukraine pause today, they may simply be preparing for another war tomorrow. The world would celebrate, yes, but diplomats would know the real struggle has only begun. Final call to action. The Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, if it were to happen, would change everything, from energy markets to global security, from European politics to China's calculations. It would bring relief, but also uncertainty. Hope, but also fragility. And that is why the world waits, holding its breath for a war that might one day, finally, fall silent. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more dramatic insights into global politics and the stories that shape our future.